He forced the iron clasp until the sealed folio snapped open beneath his hands, revealing a rubbed line that called angels executors rather than guardians. Suspicion tightened his jaw. Suspicion had led him through 3 winters of permits and polite refusals. The investigator slid a thumb over the fading ink and felt his fingertips colden, as if the parchment drew heat from the room. A voice outside the stack said, "Explain yourself." The archivist steps echoed. The folio's margin scrawl blurred into a sentence that accused the heavens of discipline, and that accusation became the immediate stake. If the passage proved genuine, institutions that relied on benevolent angels would have to answer why they suppressed this theology. He knew the cost of being right. The investigator had spent his life tracking annotations in the margins of liturgical books, filing small dissonances into larger patterns. He pushed the folio onto a slab of oak and tried to keep his hands steady. Light from a single guttering candle carved narrow planes across his face. His spectacles threw too-thin circles on the page. He worked methodically. He tapped an index finger against a rubbed sigil and listened for anyone to speak again. "Sarah," he said, keeping his tone flat. "This folio is bound to the basement stack." Someone redacted it by hand. The archivist stepped through the stacks with a lantern. The flame made her cheekbones hard. Sarah's voice held a measure of accusation. "You know the rules, investigator. You know what sealed collections mean." He folded his shoulders against the accusation. His movements, tucking the folio beneath his coat, testing the binding, said more than his words. He had expected a confrontation and had prepared the precise phrasing to placate it. He did not use the phrasing. Sarah placed a gloved hand on the oak. "Show me." Her fingers tapped the margin. She had worked these archives for 20 years. The investigator turned the folio so the lines sat between them. "They call them disciplers," he read aloud. "Careful, they command punishment and measure obedience." His voice was low. Sarah's jaw tightened. Her hand, which had steadied recent transfers of relic texts, trembled once and then stilled. They argued while they looked. "You brought it out at night." "Sarah, you broke the seal. You hid a key in the reading chamber." He replied, "You pushed me toward the basement and did not tell me why." Sarah lifted the lantern higher. Her shadow fell over the folio. "This is redacted because it causes panic. If the brothers read this, they will replace mercy with terror, or they will burn it." The investigator countered. The dialogue was tight, clipped. The room's noise narrowed to the friction of fabric and the candle's small intake of air. Sarah walked him to the candlelit reading chamber under the pretension of calm. She shut the archive door and slid a small iron key across the table. "I cannot open the cellar for you, investigator, but I can give you this. The basement holds additional copies, and some were bound differently. I warn you." The order blacked out those passages because they did not want a theology of punishment spreading within walls already taught to expect protection. He kept his face neutral. Her hand was firm when she pushed the key toward him. He tucked it into his pocket like contraband. They exchanged more than words. Sarah's eyes flicked to the folio, then to his notebook where his notes lay like small accusations of their own. The investigator felt a change inside him. What began as suspicion shifted to a cautious plan. He would pursue corroboration. Sarah's warning altered his route. Instead of leaving, he wrote a list of manuscript centers and tradespeople who might hold illicit copies. He left the chapter of their conversation with a chain of decisions made concrete. An address, a name, a time. At midnight he walked the narrow back street to an antiquarian's cramped room. Marta kept shop beneath a sign that had hung crooked for decades. The door gave without complaint. He stepped into the lamp glow and laid a folded note on the counter. Marta did not speak his full name. She read the handwriting and nodded once. "You kept me waiting 3 years, investigator," she said. "You owe me more than a coin now." Her voice was low, impatient. He slid a purse of worn coins and an annotated scrap into her palm. She weighed the coins, then the scrap, then opened a small wooden chest and withdrew a narrow leaflet printed on poor rag paper. The leaflet smelled of lamp oil. Marta set it beside the folio and watched when the sigil on the scrap responded. The lamp's flame flinched, and the oil's surface shivered. Marta inhaled and said, "I did not expect that reaction tonight." The investigator pressed the folio and scrapped together until the relics hummed. A subtle tremor that pushed a thin ripple into the lamp flame. Marta's hands flew to her mouth. "Marta," he said, naming her to steady the exchange. Where did you get this?" "I bought it from a parish binder." He saw by his mother's grave he found it under a pew where no lay reader ever sat. The dealer's confession redirected the search. The folio's provenance shifted from anonymous redaction to a physical chain of custody. The investigator recorded the binder's name. Word traveled. At pre-dawn, Brother Elia intercepted the investigator in the cloister corridor. "You have the folio?" Elia bluntly, fingers curled as if to take it. He moved quickly enough to block the investigator's path. "Brother Elia," the investigator, careful with the name. "I only seek context." Elia lunged to seize the folio. A physical struggle followed. The folio crimped, stained with a faint grey dust, slid across the stone floor. Both men reached. The folio emitted a cold pressure that stiffened their fingers and made their breath shorten. Neither man spoke for a long, measured beat. The fight left marks, a torn cuff, a bruised knuckle. Elia accused, "You steal from the house and call it research." The investigator answered in clipped lines. "I asked permission, brother. You mean to look deeper. You cannot strike then deny the finding." Their exchange ran sharp for 5 lines. Elia's voice hardened. "You choose trouble." The folio's margin gave up one more note under pressure. A small notation that recommended a binding ritual beneath the choir. Its presence altered the stakes. This was no longer academic theft. It was a mapped ritual that linked the folio to a place under the church. The investigator moved first. He refused to let Elia carry the folio to the refectory where many would touch it. He carried it instead toward the church's stone steps that led under the nave. He wrapped the folio inside his coat. The corridor's arch swallowed their footsteps. Elia followed at a distance, his pace a hard echo. The crypt smelled of damp stone and old oil. He followed a ritual notation that had been scrawled in the folio's margins. 3 knocks, pull the 3rd torch, speak the opening line. He did each action in the sequence without hesitation, fingers set in the way a man opens a long, unworn chest. The investigator's voice was steady as he read the line aloud. A reflective surface in a niche, the tinned lid of a reliquary, paled, and the angelic apparition flickered into it. The apparition did not speak. Instead, it arranged light on the lid like a visiting tide. The investigator expected fear. Instead, he felt a tightening in his limbs and a vivid focus on survival. The apparition's face tilted as if reading a ledger. It moved with precise, non-human economy. Its tattered wing brushed the stone in a sound like metal on linen. The investigator took a step back, and a small bead of sweat slid down the side of his nose. He steadied himself by pressing a fingertip to the folio where a binding sigil had been annotated. That contact drew a sharp inward breath from him. The apparition's presence became an interrogation. It did not speak in words but in implications. The folio was a ledger, and the ledger recorded transgressions and measures. The investigator's hands trembled as he read a line that named specific penances carried out in the cloister's past. He shoved a folded excerpt toward the apparition. The being extended a hand that opened like a gate. Metal on metal rang when the folio touched the niche. A small flake of stone fell into the investigator's palm. He tasted iron in the air. Brother Elias' arrival interrupted the interaction. "Investigator, step away!" Elia shouted, and his voice introduced the second major change of emotion. Anger rather than suspicion. Elia advanced with the authority of the house behind him. The apparition pivoted, its fractured halo tilting. Elia reached and tried to seize the folio. The apparition turned to him with a slow, absolute motion and placed a hand upon Elias' chest. The gesture did not harm Elia immediately, but it imposed a quiet that forced him to speak differently. Elia's hands dropped. He whispered, "What is this?" The investigator used the quiet to read aloud a phrase that bound the apparition. "By ledger and oath, you remain within the writing." His voice was firm, measured. He recited the binding line he had copied from the folio earlier. Elia's face shifted from anger to disbelief. You were a scholar, investigator. You hid a spell in your notes." The investigator answered, "I wrote the line as research. I read what was written. You can choose to bind or to burn." Elia looked at the apparition, then at the folio, then at the iron key Sarah had given. The key lay in the investigator's palm like a moral measure. Elia's decision changed the immediate course. Instead of ordering the burning, he stepped back and looked for counsel. That hesitation let the investigator finish the binding. The angelic apparition recoiled into the reflective surface with a sound that resembled the fall of thin bells. It left a smear on the reliquary lid, a pattern that the investigator traced with a fingertip and then copied into his notebook. The smear contained a rune that stung the skin where he touched it. When he let his finger go, a slight pale mark remained. He did not speak about the sting. The physical mark guided his next choices. They descended into argument in the infirmary later that morning. The investigator lay on a pallet, weak and shaken. Sarah and Marta leaned over him and argued in voices that cut between care and commerce. "We seal it, Sarah. We cannot let the brethren read this and change their rights." Marta countered with the dealer's blunt pragmatism. "Publicize it. People will buy that truth. People will pay to know that angels punish as much as they protect." The investigator opened one eye. His throat rasped. He spoke a single sentence. "You both decide what the folio becomes." The choice moved the power from him to them. Sarah's hands trembled when she reached for the folio. "If we reveal, the house will fracture. If we hide, the house will keep its order but lie to itself." Marta tapped the folio's edge with 2 fingernails and said, "Reveal, then sell. The truth will force institutions to change or crumble." Their dialogue contained the chapter's essential divide. Concealment to preserve order or exposure to force reckoning. The investigator listened, measured, and added, "If you expose it, name the binder." He named the binder Marta had mentioned. That simple demand created a new external event. Marta's hesitation revealed a connection she had not expected to be questioned. Marta's face closed for a moment. "You would name him?" she asked. The investigator repeated, "Name him, Marta." Responsibility follows knowledge. Marta looked down and then nodded once. She them the binder's surname. The revelation shifted loyalties. Sarah made the choice that changed the chapter's final turn. She chose to reseal the folio but to keep a copy for careful study, and she asked the investigator to copy specific passages into his notebook rather than burn them. Her voice was small and exact. "We cannot hand this to the brethren. We will limit harm. We will study it quietly." Marta spit on the floor in frustration and left the infirmary cursing. The investigator obeyed Sarah's instruction. He copied the forbidden passages letter by letter. His pen scratched in short breaths. The rune on his wrist pulsed once as he wrote. He felt a cold pressure deep in his palm, and then a quiet that was not relief but resolution. He had committed to carrying this knowledge, binding it to his body and notes. That commitment altered him physically. The scarred crease along his brow tightened. His spectacles dug into the bridge of his nose, and his hands bore ink stains that would not come off. Before he left the infirmary, Sarah produced a small sealed packet. "Keep this safe," she said, "and do not bring it beneath the chapel again without warning me." He promised. He left with the packet nested in his coat, and the folio hidden where no one would find it easily. The morning work of the house continued around him. Bells bred duty. He moved through those tasks with a new core of attention. The emotion that had begun as suspicion had shifted through anger and disbelief into a resigned determination to pursue the ledger. In his study that night he sat under a single lamp and copied a final line into his worn leather-filled notebook. He described exactly what the folio recorded: names, dates, and the nature of punitive acts prescribed by the early angelologies. He wrote it with short sentences. He tapped a page corner to mark the passage. The rune on his wrist itched. He put a fingertip to it and felt a faint warmth. He closed the notebook, put the pen into his pocket, and pressed his palm over the seal of the folio he left in a narrow chest. He heard a soft knock on the shutter, Ceres warning, perhaps, or Mater Sandra, but he did not rise immediately. He finished by committing the final motion to concrete action. He locked the chest, slid the iron key into a small padded sheath, and set both on a shelf behind a row of unremarkable law books. He put the lamp out. The last image of the chapter is precise and physical. His fingers brushing ink, stained paper, the faint glow of the rune on his wrist, the closed chest heavy with the weight of decisions. He had resolved the immediate dispute. The folio remained unpublished. Copies were kept, names were recorded. The investigator carried both knowledge and a mark. The chapter did not end with an answer about angels. It ended with an act, copying, sealing, and deciding to continue the search. The archivists snatched the folio and bared a fresh scorch along its margins before the investigator could close his hand. Suspicion tightened his jaw. Suspicion had driven him through 3 winters of permits and polite refusals, and it moved him now to step forward, fingers still damp from the folio's vellum. Archivist. The investigator, voice low and contained. The archivist did not answer immediately. He pressed the book flat against his chest, thumbs white along the leather strap. They stood beneath the cloister's vaulted arcade, moonlight pooling in the stone gutters, a lantern guttering at a monk's elbow. The central problem was raw and visible. The folio had been opened in the cloister, its margins freshly scorched, and someone had performed a recent ritual on a text the monastery kept under seal. The investigator's movement was one of study and force. He reached for the folio again. "You are not permitted." Prior Alaric from the shadows of the archway, voice even and edged. The investigator tightened his grip on the worn leather notebook at his belt and pulled back, refusing to be diverted by clerical courtesy. He had entered the cloister hunting answers. Now the cloister itself became an accuser. Within the first minutes, the investigator's suspicion shifted toward alarm when the archivist produced a small iron hook and, with a practiced hand, traced the scorch upward to reveal a faint glyph. He whispered, "This was burned in last night." The investigator's chest tightened. He watched the archivist's fingers leave smudged ash across the vellum. The concrete stakes were clear. Someone inside the monastery had touched the folio after it had been sealed, and the act carried danger that rose beyond scholarship to immediate threat. They filed into the scriptorium with candles guttering along the lecterns. The investigator's background, mid-40s, lean, coat carrying ink stains, showed in the way he moved between desks, scanning marginalia with the instinct of a man who lived by texts. He did not introduce himself. His badge of authority had long been the patience of someone who knew archives' secret geometries. Prior Alaric stepped forward, fingers spread. "You forced the clasp last season." Alaric accused, "You forced it open." "That is sacrilege, investigator." The investigator answered with a clipped sentence. "I read what it says." Alaric's hand struck a lectern top. "You read what men should not read." "You already brought the folio into danger." The monastic librarian moved beside Alaric, and the room contracted in heat. "We will remove pages. We will eradicate words." The investigator felt a second emotion shift, from alarm to indignation. He set his leather notebook on the table and opened to a page of copied marginalia, tapping a line with a stained fingertip. "You claim allegory," he said. The marginalia cite a living binding. The scribe recorded execution. The librarian laughed, small and brittle. "This is law, not story," he said. "Angels execute. Angels do not converse." A shadow, scribe emerged from an aisle between shelves. hands folded behind his back until they trembled. He kept his head bowed, voice a reed, and when he spoke the scriptorium stilled. "I wrote the note," he said. "I saw the chain. I hid where no one would find me." The investigator stepped closer to the shadow scribe and asked, "What did you see?" The scribe's fingers found a seam in his sleeve and pulled free a narrow sheet of parchment folded small. He described a binding performed in the cloister's outer garth. A woman bound in rope, a figure with a halo that cracked like old silver, and a smell of cold iron. The shadow scribe named Novice Miriam as the woman who had been touched. The investigator as jaw set, his suspicion hardened into resolve. Bring Miriam. Now, the prior shook his head, voice tight with clerical authority and fear. "We do not speak of the novices. We contain..." Outside the scriptorium, the cloister air held the salt of laundry and the distant sound of a lead bell. The investigator did not allow the prior's authority to deflect him. He moved to the archive alcove and guided the shadow scribe to a low lamp. The scribe unfolded the parchment and produced marginalia the investigator had suspected from the rubbed lines in the forbidden folio. A named binding, a list of decrees, a date within living memory. The investigator read aloud, fingers following ink as if to pin the words to the present. This was an eyewitness account, the shadow scribe, voice quickening. "I wrote it after I left the gallery that night. I thought it safer under the stone. I thought I had hidden it," he swallowed. "They burned the edges twice." The marks returned. The investigator felt the room tilt toward danger. His actions narrowed to preservation. They moved as a group toward the subterranean chapel at midnight. The monastic ritual team had already gathered beneath choir stalls, candles arranged on the altar and salt drawn in a narrow circle. The investigator counted faces by the set of their shoulders, cataloguing who might aid and who would obstruct. He noticed Prior Alaric's hands, callous ridges near the knuckles, and in that practical detail found a hint of a man who had performed tasks by hand, perhaps even bindings. The ritual began with a measured chant. The investigator edged to the periphery with the monastic librarian at his elbow, watching the pattern of ink on the folio as the monks read aloud. The angelic apparition manifested as a towering silhouette at the altar, a presence felt first in the clink of chains and then in the way candles guttered. The investigator's second major emotion shift moved from resolve into fear when the apparition extended a limb and snuffed a votive flame near his shoulder. The flames died to black points back, Prior Alaric ordered. He moved to the altar and laid a palm on the folio, reciting a line of Latin the investigator had seen half, remembered in the forbidden folio, Octoritus Alaric intoned. "This is law. This is not metaphor." The angelic apparition's outline remained deliberate, slow, its damaged halo hanging askew. The investigator felt a physical pressure in his wrists as if the air tightened. His fingers flexed around the notebook. Novice Miriam collapsed in the crypt antechamber before dawn. She had blood along one palm where she had touched the folio in a hurried attempt to secure it. She folded into a chair and said, "I saw its face." It turned like stone. The investigator crouched and put his hand at the back of her neck, feeling the heat of fever under damp hair. "Miriam," he said, "how did you touch it?" She answered in a clipped voice, "I brushed the text. I thought only to learn." It left a mark. Her words changed the prior's pitch from denial to urgent containment. Prior Alaric snapped, "We bind it. We seal the folio. We call the censors." The monastic librarian began listing measures, inventorying, burning duplicates, removing scribal copies. The investigator watched Alaric's face as details of command slipped across it. He read the man's decisions as actions rather than pleas. Alaric reached for a length of cord and began to bind the folio. In the burial crypt, the climax erupted as the angelic apparition, solid now in candle, scarred air, lashed spectral chains around the investigator. The chains did not bite the skin so much as weigh the investigator's arms to immobility, pressing his elbows to his ribs. Prior Alaric lunged at the folio and attempted to seal it with a clasp of iron and prayer, while the angelic apparition pivoted its head and fixed a pale gold gaze on the investigator. "Let it go," Alaric barked, voice splitting. He struck the folio. "Give me the book." "Give it now." The investigator managed one movement. He pushed the notebook into his coat and, by habit, protected the pages he had copied earlier. He felt a hot brand press against his forearm where the apparition's chain wrapped, and a sigil glowed briefly on his skin. He tried to wrench free. The angelic apparition's voice cut like metal. "Law," it intoned. "Law executed." The investigator's sphere focused into a single thought. "Preserve the text," he shouted. "Alaric, hold." Prior Alaric responded with 3 clipped orders to his monks: bind, chant, pull. The monastic ritual team hived on the folio while the shadow scribe shoved a lamp under a brazier to flare light across the pages. At the mid-climax, a mini-cliffhanger occurred when the lamp flickered and one of the monks dropped the iron clasp. The folio slid toward the altar's edge, threatening to fall into a pile of carved bones. The investigator's fingers twitched against the chain. He made a half-step and swore, "Do not let it fall." The folio dangled. Someone reached with a gloved hand, Novice Miriam's hand, and caught the book by its lower corner, eyes wide and white with exertion. The twist arrived in the next breath. Novice Miriam did not simply catch the folio. She had a fresh line of ink across her palm, handwriting identical to the shadow scribe's marginal note. "I wrote," she said, voice ragged. "I wrote that note and hid it. I thought it would protect her." The room recoiled. Prior Alaric stumbled backward and whispered, "You did this." Miriam's gaze cut to Alaric. We were to hide it. You taught me the seals. It would keep her away." The revelation reframed events. The scorch, the burning, and the marginalia were not simple suppression by the chapter. They were part of an internal program, Alaric's program, of containment that employed novices to perform the concealments. The investigator's suspicion turned into a new, sharper betrayal. He realized the monastery's leadership had used novices as agents. He felt outrage in the way his hands clenched the chain. Words broke into action. "Alaric," the investigator, voice controlled. "Did you teach Miriam the seals? Did you order the burns?" Prior Alaric's face reddened. "I taught the rites to contain it," he said. "I taught them to preserve the order." "We are priests before we are scholars," the shadow scribe interjected. "Order does not mean you conscript children into rites." Miriam bled for it. Tension flipped again, from accusation to a desperate scramble for control. The angelic apparition tightened the chains enough for the investigator to inhale with difficulty. He tasted iron and old dust, and the brass watch at his waist felt suddenly heavier. "Release him," Alaric commanded, voice raw. The apparition extended a hand, its fingers like folded doors. It did not release. It lifted instead and struck the stone with a hollow sound that echoed in the crypt. Outside the crypt at dawn, the folio was confiscated. The ecclesiastical censor arrived with a ledger and a clipped stare. His summary motions, flipping pages, listing folio identifiers, felt like a legal curtain being drawn. The investigator woke in the infirmary with a smoldering sigil sealed on his wrist. Peat smoke clung to his sleeves. He found his field notebook missing from its usual inner pocket, but the pages he decopied lay inside his coat, intact. His role changed from scholar to hunted dissident in a single breath. The investigator spoke first when the censor demanded a statement. "I observed a binding," he said, voice even. "I saw the angelic apparition enforce a mark." The censor wrote without looking up, "You must surrender those pages." The investigator did not surrender the copies. He felt a careful calculation replace his immediate fear. Survival required secrecy and alliance. Under the cloister at morning, in a hidden alcove below a shelf of condemned sermons, the investigator bound an alliance with the shadow, scribe and novice Miriam. The shadow, scribe's fingers shook as he sealed a small packet with hot wax. Miriam propped herself on a bench, rubbing the tender line along her palm with the pad of her thumb. The investigator laid his thick hand over both their clasped hands and said, "We will preserve this. We will publish when it is safe." He did not promise triumph. He promised action. The chapter ends with concrete beats rather than abstract declarations. The folio was gone from their possession. The censor had it catalogued. Prior Alaric went to a private chamber for disciplinary measures, and the archivist returned to the stacks with ash on his thumbs. The investigator strapped the brass pocket watch back at his vest, feeling its weight as if it measured a deadline. Emotion threads through the chapter. Suspicion drove entry, alarm forced confrontation, fear converted to resolve, betrayal reshaped alliances. Those shifts appear in the investigator's hands and choices, reaching for the folio, reading marginalia aloud, protecting copied pages, and finally forming a secret alliance. The investigator's choices end this chapter with a concrete decision. Keep the copied pages, protect Miriam and the shadow, scribe, and prepare for a hunt that will follow them beyond the cloister. A final action punctuates the close. Miriam folded the small parchment into her sleeve and whispered, "If they come for us, hide the ink in the well beneath the old elms." The investigator nodded and turned away, leaving the hidden alcove with the three names, investigator, Miriam, shadow, scribe, imprinted in the small circle of morning light. He strapped the brass watch, flexed the mark on his wrist, and stepped into the cloister where monks moved like cogs of duty, unaware that the seal had been broken and that a new list of enemies would soon be drawn. He pried the iron clasp free, and the hollow fragment clattered into his palm, warm from the altar stone. Suspicion drove him to force the side, chamber door 3 nights earlier. Now suspicion tightened each decision he made as he looked at the shard. The problem was immediate and concrete. The folio in his coat named angels as executors of punishment, and a broken hallow embedded in an altar proved the manuscript described instruments, not protectors.